World oil discoveries have been declining since 1964. Yes, we are finding more oil. We're finding oil in Brazil. Yes, it's offshore under 3 miles of ocean water in circumstances that will require the development of whole new technologies to access it. We're finding oil in polar regions. We're finding oil in countries that are so politically unstable that no oil company wants to operate there. The cheap, easy stuff is gone. That's the problem. And we're seeing that in terms of actual oil supplies. This is crude oil production over the past, going back to 2001. And as you can see, we've been in a plateau since 2005. Now, it's not as though there's no new demand. If the oil were coming to market and if it were affordable, there are plenty of people, especially in China, who'd really love to use that stuff. But what's been happening is the Chinese have been using more of it, and as a result of contracting economy, we've been using less of it. So demand is shifting to Asia because they can afford more expensive oil, given the fact that people there are just buying their first car, and they're willing to pay more. This is what the oil industry looked like a few decades ago. This is what it looks like today. You know, again, it's not that we're running out of these resources, but we are running out of the stuff that's affordable and that makes our economy go. This is from the not the International Energy Agency. This is the U.S. Department of Energy, the Energy Information Administration. And the different slices there account for OPEC, non-OPEC, conventional oil, unconventional oil of different kinds. So that's all the stuff that we know about, the colored bars. And as you can see, it starts to kind of run down right around now, around 2012. But not to worry, we'll still be able to grow supplies from unidentified projects. Now, yeah, undoubtedly, currently unidentified projects will appear, and we will be able to get more oil from them. But from the standpoint of the U.S. Department of Energy, this is, don't worry, be happy, everything's fine, easy motoring. I look at that chart and a different thought comes to mind. I would suggest that the world price of oil is effectively a cap on economic growth for the United States and a few other highly industrialized countries currently. Why so? Because currently, the oil industry needs prices in the range of $80 a barrel. Arguably, different projects have different entry points, $70, $80, $90 a barrel. In order to justify new exploration and production. But we've seen from recent economic history that every time the oil price spikes, we see a recession as a result. The gray bars are historic recessions going back to 1970. And you can see a very clear correlation. Now, correlation is not causation, I understand that, but it does kind of make you wonder. And look at what happened in 2008, the biggest oil price spike in history and the worst economic contraction since the Great Depression, both happening the same year. Nice coincidence. Now, of course, there were other things going on. We had the housing bubble, et cetera. But interestingly, where the housing bubble started to burst was in suburban areas where people had long commutes. They had the big SUVs. It was costing them over $100 to fill up. And so that meant they had less money with which to pay mortgages and other bills. And that's where the bubble started to hemorrhage. Well, this is a big deal because we've created a transport system in this country that depends upon liquid fuel. And we really don't have other good options for liquid fuels. Yeah, we could all be driving electric cars, but it's going to take a while. You know, right now, the penetration of electric cars into the market is, I don't know, what is it? That's considerably less than 1%. How long will it take to get that up to 20%? Much less 80% or 100%. And then, once we do that, it takes, how long does it take to change out the whole fleet? Not everybody buys a new car every year. It takes 20 years to change out the fleet. So we're talking about a multi-decade process of adaptation. And we're not going to be running electric airliners. There are parts of our transport system that just aren't very flexible in terms of how we run them. And then there's our food system, which is overwhelmingly dependent on liquid fuels for transporting inputs to the farm, and many of those inputs are themselves made out of fossil fuels, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and then transporting outputs from the farm ultimately to the consumer's plate. It could be 1,500 miles, that's the average, and then of course consumers have to get in their cars and drive to the supermarket to pick up the stuff and drive it home and microwave it and all the rest. So over the past few years, we've started to see this interesting correlation between food prices and energy prices. Now, we are seeing a global food crisis right now as a result of record high food prices. That's not all due to fuel prices. It's also due, of course, to weird weather, to droughts and floods, and destruction of crops. But the correlation between food prices and oil prices is extraordinary, and it's leading to social unrest increasingly all across the world, and especially in countries with a young, fast-growing population. So you have a lot of unemployed young people who can't really look forward to a career and who can't afford increasingly expensive food and fuel. So increasingly expensive fuel is making food more expensive. It's also making other mineral resources more expensive. Why so? Well, up until about the year 2000, mineral resources were actually generally getting cheaper with every passing year. It's counterintuitive. These are non-renewable resources. Why would they be getting cheaper as we deplete them? It's because we were applying more and more cheap energy to digging deeper, to refining lower grade ores, and to globalizing the whole process of resource exploration, extraction, and trade. So whether it was copper ore, iron ore, bauxite, prices were generally declining through the 70s and 80s and 90s, up until 2000. Last decade has been different, 65%. This is just a few of these interesting mineral ores that happen to be useful in the renewable energy and computer technology industries. But of course, the list is much longer. If you take the longer list of about 105 important mineral commodities, about 65% of them have seen substantial price increases since the year 2000 because energy prices are going up, which makes everything else more difficult. So we need alternative energy sources, of course, but we're getting a late start in making the transition away from fossil fuels. The problem was fossil fuels were so good. They were so easy and cheap and concentrated that it made the alternatives economically problematic. But of course, we should have had a longer view. We should have been looking out not just for the next quarterly profit. We should have been looking out a decade or two or three, because you don't change the energy economy of a country like the United States in a year or two when it becomes politically convenient to do so. This is a multi-decade process, and we've invested trillions in our current transport and agriculture infrastructure, not to mention coal power plants and oil refineries and all the rest. So this is a big deal. We did a study at Post Carbon Institute looking at 18 different energy sources, measuring them across 10 criteria, including the energy that's returned on the energy we invest in getting energy, location of the resource, the abundance of the resource. Is it constant, user controllable, or is it something that's intermittent like solar and wind? And if so, what do we have to do to make up for that? We could not identify a likely scenario in which energy supplies would continue to grow as fossil fuels decline. Now, that's certainly not to say that there are no valid or useful alternative energy sources. Quite the contrary. We identified several, and we should be investing in them. The point was, we shouldn't expect energy supplies and therefore economic growth to continue as we're making the transition. And of course, that's a message nobody wants to hear. Even many environmental groups consider that a radioactive conclusion. Nobody should touch it. But what if it's true? Now, I've identified for you two buckets of factors that I believe are leading to the end of economic growth as we've known it. One bucket we could call debt, the second depletion, and the third, to keep up with the D's, let's call disaster. Environmental disasters, directly humanly caused, indirectly humanly caused, and who knows, are all increasing and at a rapid rate. We're seeing floods, fires, earthquakes, all proliferating at a rapid rate. Now, a lot of that is climate change, and it's nice to be in a state where I can actually talk about climate change. It's extraordinary, you know, in this country we have a political situation where one of our major parties has decided that this is a litmus test. You know, no candidate for office is permitted to believe in that climate change even exists, or if they do, that it's caused by human beings. Well, when I'm in front of one of those audiences, I say, who cares? Whether you believe in it or not, whether you think it's caused by human beings or not, the fact, you know, don't ask me, ask the insurance companies, because the costs are mounting, the costs of floods and droughts. In 2010, we had a major drought in Russia, huge flood in Pakistan, and of course the industrial disaster of Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico. Those are three examples. The list is, of course, much longer, and the total cost measured by the insurance companies was in the range of $250 billion, which is substantial. This year, we passed the $250 billion mark in June. So we're seeing this constant ratcheting up of the cost of disasters. Every year is described as being unprecedented. So what this does, not only does it impose direct costs on national economies and states and regions, but also it wreaks havoc with the insurance industry, which no longer knows how to value risk. And when we're talking, for example, about crop insurance, insurance is very important. Now, of course, crop insurance in this country is largely subsidized by the government, but somebody ends up paying for it, and it ends up costing society. So this, again, is a drag, and it's a substantial drag on economic growth. And if you project out the likely costs of climate change over the course of the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, by the time we get about 3 or 4 decades out, it's completely overwhelming not only economic growth, but also a substantial part of current economic activity. So, for the past few decades, we've been on sort of a runaway train. We've been using more, we've been talking ourselves into wanting to buy and use and consume more. We've thought of this as a very good thing. In fact, we want the train to speed up because that's economic growth. And with more economic growth, we get more jobs, higher returns on investment. And so there's every incentive to want to, step on the accelerator and keep this thing going, and not only going at the current rate, but also speeding up as much as we can make it go. The problem is that we live on a small planet. You look at this thing from space, and it's this miraculous, beautiful little jewel in black emptiness, and that's all there is. That's all we've got. So, when I was doing research for the book, as I was talking to these folks, it was remarkable, sobering conversations with former Wall Street insiders and resource economists. These people, this is the future that they were telling me about. Declining tax revenues, we're seeing that everywhere. Now, of course, we'd like to think that's just a little temporary blip, but what if it's not? What if this continues? Persistent high unemployment, declining household income and net worth, financial system instability. This is what we are seeing. And there's not much on the horizon to suggest that trajectory is likely to change anytime soon. So the remedy that's being proposed is austerity. Government has bailed out the banks and stimulated the economy in as much as it could. But now with declining tax revenues, governments can't afford to take on more debt. And in other countries, for the US right now, borrowing is cheap. But for most other countries, particularly European countries, and particularly some European countries, borrowing is getting very expensive. So the remedy is austerity. And we're about to see austerity come home to roost here in this country very strongly, which basically just means cutbacks in spending and services and increasing scarcity and poverty. So that's what we're asking for. A very large part of the American electorate is saying, yeah, bring it on. We want more of that. Okay, it's coming. We'll see how we like it. Already there are quite a few folks who are saying they don't want so much of that. It doesn't look too attractive. And after all, we did bail out the Wall Street bankers. A lot of these folks are saying, "Where's my bailout?" After the 2008 crash, the U.S. government impaneled a commission to study what happened with the crash, how it happened, and so on. The commission came back with a very good report, and it described in some detail how, for example, Goldman Sachs defrauded its own customers. It's all there in the report. But nobody's gone to jail. Nobody's even up on charges. So you can see why a few people are getting a little hot under the collar. Is this the beginning of breakdown in social order in the country? It's possible. I certainly sympathize with these folks, and I think if their anger and frustration can be channeled in the right direction, and by the right direction, I mean it's up to them what they do with it. But I would suggest, getting the corruption out of the U.S. political system, because right now, with both political parties basically being bought and paid for by corporate interests, it's almost impossible to actually get anything that desperately needs to be done in this country actually accomplished. So if they could do that, that would certainly be worth it. Once we get the logjam broken, there are a number of things that desperately need to be done in order for our nation to adapt to the end of growth. One of them is getting rid of GDP. GDP is our yeah. It's a perverse indicator, and yet it's the single index of national health that we rely upon most. Again, it's just a marker for money spent and thus for consumption levels. Well, all the promises that are being made about increasing GDP are hollow promises, and they are going to fall on parched soil. Whereas it's entirely possible for us to have a better way of life. It's the end of growth in the sense of GDP doesn't mean the end of the world. It doesn't mean the end of improvement in human life. We've actually sacrificed a lot in order to have the kind of consumer economy that we have today. We've sacrificed a lot in terms of, well, a lot of things that we used to have in abundance. Intergenerational solidarity. When you have planned obsolescence and new technologies coming on all the time, well, that's good for the economy, but it means that parents can't talk to their children anymore. They no longer have common terms of reference, cultural terms of reference. We can have more of all of these things even as we consume less stuff. Americans are using twice as much energy as people in Europe, 3 times as much as people in Denmark, for example. Now, are Danish people only a third as happy as Americans? Actually, it's kind of not exactly the other way around, but they're actually happier than we are. So whatever they're smoking, we should have some of that, And it's no secret. It's a matter of what we're aiming for. It's what are our priorities as a nation? Are our priorities, healthy and functional communities? A sense of participation and volunteerism, all of that stuff makes people happy, whereas pure GDP growth very often doesn't. We need to build local resilience. I emphasize local because as transport fuels get less affordable, and I'm not one who likes to forecast oil prices. Some of my colleagues say, oh, in 5 years oil is going to cost $300 a barrel. Well, maybe not. You know, maybe in 5 years, oil is going to be $30 a barrel, but nobody's going to be able to afford it at those prices because nobody will have any money. You know, who knows? Prices at this point are, I believe, extremely volatile, likely to be extremely volatile and very difficult to forecast. What I think we can forecast with some confidence is that energy is going to become less affordable to more and more people. And that means we're going to be less mobile as a nation. So we need to build more local community resilience, the ability to withstand shocks and keep on functioning. We have to build resilience in our food systems, our transport systems, and throughout society. That means people talking to one another and working together and sharing with one another. We're going to have to reform economics as a discipline. You know, economics has really grown up in this anomalous, brief period of human history of the last 200 years. So economists internalized all of this economic growth that was happening around them. And they said, oh, it's because of the magic of the market. And of course, it can go on forever. And they got this bizarre idea that the entire natural environment is just a subset of the economy. It's just a set of resources that we extract and use to make products, and of course those ultimately become waste. Of course, the exact opposite is true. The entire human economy is a subset of the environment, always has been, always will be. If we have no functioning ecosystem, we have no economy. So we have to get that straight. It's absolutely essential. We have to understand that growth in population and consumption levels is, by definition, not sustainable. We can do it for a while, yes, but not in perpetuity, and we reach limits. We have to understand that renewable resources have to be harvested at less than the rate of natural replenishment. Any 10-year-old can easily understand this principle. It's much harder for a PhD economist to get this. Non-renewable resources have to be recycled, and where we're using resources that can't be recycled, like fossil fuels, our use of them has to decline at rapid rates. Okay, these are very simple, intuitive, obvious principles. Okay, now, can we abide by those principles and still make one of these? I don't know, is the answer to that. But we should try. You know, if these things are really so important to us, if this is really the coolest thing that ever existed, then we should figure out how to make them without using Chinese slave labor, people working in environmental conditions that we would never wish on anyone, and bringing together rare earth elements and other often toxic and costly and depleting non-renewable resources to manufacture. You know, if we can make one of these from abundant and local resources using local labor that's paid decently, wouldn't that be a good idea? Can we do it? Well, that would be a good senior class project for some college students. I've been suggesting in my travels that we also need to start, you know, some emergency preparations at the community level. Most communities around the country already have, you know, a credit union, a food co-op, some of these elements, but they're fringe. They're the alternative. As the economy continues to fray, this is what we'll have to fall back on increasingly. So it needs to be brought to the center of Main Street and made clearly available to everyone. So when people need help, they know where to go. When people want to volunteer and offer their resources, their extra garden veggies, their lawnmower that they only use once a week, they can offer it to a tool library, or, you know, we have some place where everyone knows to go in every town. I'm going to finish just by suggesting that as big a deal as I have made this out to be, it may be even more important than that. Perhaps this is a fundamental turning point, not just in recent economic history, but a fundamental turning point in our history as a species. We go back a long way, after all, and we're a clever sort, we, Homo sapiens. Starting roughly 3 million years ago, nobody's exactly sure when, we harnessed fire. And that meant we could cook our food. We could alter our environments. We used fire very often to burn off grasses or low-lying woody plants and create space for the kinds of plants and animals that we wanted to flourish. So fire was very powerful development in the course of our history. The next one was just as significant, the adoption of language. Every species communicates. Even trees communicate with each other through biochemicals. But language is different. It's the use of abstract signs and symbols with no inherent meaning. You know, when I use the word meaning, unless you know the English language, there's no reason for you to know what the word meaning is. But we're so accustomed to translating these abstract signs and symbols that we've developed these big brains just so we can do that. And language has given us enormous power over our environments. Just try to imagine putting together a hunting party to bring down a mastodon, without language. So you can say, I'll go over here, you go over there. When I give the signal, you throw the spear. You know, it made a lot of things possible to us that hadn't been possible before, and it made us a very powerful species. Then agriculture, starting 10,000 years ago, enabled us to produce seasonal surpluses of grains that could be stored for long periods of time. So that enabled urbanization. It enabled the rise of empires, full-time division of labor, writing, mathematics, money. All of these things flowed from agriculture. Again, gave us enormous power over our environments, enabled us to increase our population on any given area of land. The industrial fossil fuel revolution of the past 200 years, I've already talked about that, extraordinary increase in human power over the environment, unprecedented really in scope, far greater in many respects, even though it's only been 200 years, far greater in scope than any of the previous revolutions or transitions. But in many ways, it's run its course. We've reached a fundamental turning point, and whether we call this the sustainability revolution, I'm not a big fan of the word. Maybe in a couple of hundred years we'll have come up with a better word to describe it, or maybe in 5 years, who knows. In retrospect, perhaps it'll be easier for us to describe it. But clearly, we are at a point of having to recognize Earth's inherent limits and learn how to live within those limits. It's as though finally we are growing up as a species. All of these previous transitions were about expanding our control over the natural world. And it was pretty easy, giving a person greater access to resources, it's a pretty easy sell. But coming to a point where we understand that there are limits to how much we can use and that we have to adapt to those limits. We have to exercise self-restraint. Actually, people in traditional cultures did that because they had to confront natural limits. And one of the curses of the Industrial Revolution is that it removed so many limits that we came to believe as a species and as a nation that there weren't any limits. The sky is the limit, that we could do anything. Well, guess what? We still do live on a finite planet. And coming to terms with that, finally, I think will be our maturity as a species. It'll be a profound transition that I think will shape not only ourselves, but the lives of future generations. And if we pull this off, well, if we make this transition with a minimum of damage to the environment, to other species, and to the mass of humanity who are going to be going through this, if we can pull that off well, I think then our children and grandchildren will thank us. If we don't, they may not have very kind words for us. So, I realize this is a kind of bracing message, but I hope you understand why I feel it's so important to bring this out and to talk about it. If you want to find out more about anything that I talked about today, of course, there's my book, The End of Growth, but also almost everything that we do at Post Carbon Institute is available for free on our website. You can download all of our reports on energy resources from that site, and it's postcarbon.org. And we also have a sister site called energybulletin.net, which is updated on a daily basis with all kinds of articles and news related to this profound transition that we're doing together. And I would also mention that there are grassroots organizations like the Transition Initiatives that are mobilizing people all over the place to voluntarily engage in this sustainability transition. So even though it may not look like it on the surface, I think between Occupy Wall Street and the transition movement and a number of others, there actually is a very rapid and widespread upwelling of interest in engaging with this process. So there's actually a lot going on to be aware of, to take heart from, and to support. Thank you very much.